Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Road to Purpose, episode 3. My name is Angus. Thank you for joining me once again here for another episode of the podcast. I've been really enjoying this project. It's something completely new for me. I've never got to episode 3 of a podcast before. I once tried to release a podcast before, and I got 2 episodes in, and then kind of didn't make time for it and things like that. But I'm going to be much more committed this time with this podcast. Trust me. So, yeah, here we are with episode 3. Here's a backstory behind this episode. So, I've actually scripted out in my journal an episode it's very planned, it's very organized. It's about controlling your emotions as a man, and that's something very important. But I wanted to record this episode, and I feel really motivated to record this episode, which is a bit more off the cuff instead, which is a more of a personal episode. I think that it's important that you have some background on me as I'm the host of this podcast. But I've got some life lessons that I've picked up over the last few months after a load of disasters, basically. So this episode is going to be kind of documenting a long period of time, but specifically, there's going to be some lessons from the last few months that I think are worth sharing. So, yeah. And before we get started, I've been reviewing each podcast, the previous 2, as we've been going. And I picked up on some things that I need to improve on. Definitely. You can see in the previous one, I had the mic like here all the time. And I'm going to try and avoid doing that this time. Not sure what made me do that. Also, where I was like reading from my notes, I wasn't like looking into the camera as much. But where this is a bit more off the cuff, I feel like it will be a bit more engaging from the audience perspective, from your perspective as you're watching or listening to this. And yeah, let's get into this podcast. And I'm gonna start from roughly 2 years ago because this context is relevant to how I even got to where I am right now. Actually, let's just say where I am right now. I'm still in Bogota, Colombia. I mentioned this in the previous episode. And the story of how I got here is a bit crazy. It involves me following a dream. And basically, there's been quite a lot of crazy events that have come out of this move. And I'll get into those later on. But for context, right now, I'm recording from Bogota, Colombia. And yeah, let's get started. So 2 years ago, I'm going to cast your minds back to 2022. In 2022, I went on my first ever solo backpacking trip. And where did I go? Colombia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. I did 3.5 months of solo backpacking. And that was my first large solo trip. I previously experimented with staying in hostels, but on a trip away with friends in Barcelona. So this was the first big backpacking trip that I'd done. I managed to get sabbatical leave from my job as a software developer. And this was very exciting, something I wanted to do for a very long time. And I look back on this trip as one of the greatest experiences of my life. It changed a lot for me. And this trip was incredible. So the first place I came to was Colombia. I started in Cartagena on the coast and worked my way down through the country. I won't go into the full details of the whole trip because that could be a whole podcast in itself of all the events that went down. But basically, I fell in love with the idea of traveling, specifically traveling slowly. Now, one thing I really hate, I've learned to hate, is traveling quickly. And I have some friends and I've traveled with people before who like this style of traveling. And I've met a lot of backpackers who like to travel like this as well, and it usually occurs because they have a short period of time to travel, but within a week or 2-week period, they try and cram in as much as possible. I'm the absolute opposite. So, for example, on this trip, and ever since that trip, actually 2 years ago, I've been staying in places for a lot longer. A few of the places I've stayed have been Albania, Bulgaria. We'll get into this. But basically, I really like traveling slowly. I really like traveling slowly, getting to know a place and getting to experience it from like a local perspective, as opposed to just passing through as a tourist. Because the truth is, on my trip 2 years ago, I started off traveling very quickly because I wanted to see as much as possible. I was super excited. And honestly, I feel like I didn't get a very local experience that time. I got a tourist experience and I got the expensive experience as well, because the places that I visited were the places that everyone visits. And they were the places that are most popular with backpackers. And yeah, I've definitely am of the opinion that a lot of backpackers have this list of places to visit, and they're the ones which every other backpacker goes to. Unfortunately, this is not a great way to get a local perspective. Now, I did have a slightly local perspective in my last trip because I have friends in Latin America. I'm fluent in Spanish and I've been learning since 2020. Yeah, 2020. So I have some friends from Latin America and they gave me some fantastic experiences, and I managed to meet them and heard their stories, and I'm always talking to them about their life. And so I did get a slightly more local experience, I guess, than the majority of backpackers who might not meet locals. But yeah, it definitely, the backpacking experience for me is definitely not quite compatible. I'm a little bit unusual from that respect. I love to solo travel, but I don't like to be surrounded by loads of other travelers. So the 3 month trip, 3.5 month trip ends, and I return to my job in the UK. And the only thing I can think about is the fact that I need to find a way to sustainably travel and work. Now, this is actually a pretty complicated task, as I would soon discover, that I couldn't really see a feasible way to do it, especially from Latin America. I wanted to come back to Latin America because I felt like I kind of had unfinished business here, and definitely wanted to spend more time in Colombia in particular and just get to know this country and other countries in Latin America a lot better, practice my Spanish, make more friends. That was basically the idea. And it seemed a little bit unattainable. When I returned to the UK, I went back to my office job and I worked there for another like 6 to 8 months, I'd say. And all that time I was applying for other jobs. I wanted to be a web developer. I was working for like a robotics company. It's cool. It's a cool company to work for, but it was in my hometown. I was living with my parents. And after the peak of excitement of traveling around the world, it wasn't exactly what I wanted, but I was saving money and I was content, and I love my parents, love my family. And yeah, it was great. It was great to be home, but I was chasing something more. So I eventually, in what year is this now? March 2023, landed my first ever remote working job. Now, this is something I've never looked back on. I've never gone back to office until now, and I've got no plans to go back to the office. I never want to do that really, with one exception, which I'll come to a bit later. So I landed my first ever remote working job, which was for a UK company working on a secure file storage platform, and as a web developer, which is what I wanted to do. And I was super excited because I was going to get to use the technology that I've been passionate about learning, and I've been learning in my spare time. So yeah, was living at home still, working remotely, cool setup, good company, enjoyed the job. And so I had a 6 month probation there. And I was like, okay, so this is my first ever time working for a web development company. I'm just going to stay put in the UK. You can see where this is going, can't you? So I'm going to stay put in the UK for now. And I'm not going to move around. I'm just going to stay living with my parents for now. So for the first 6 months, I did exactly that. And actually, I moved abroad towards the end of that 6 month probation and actually had my end of probation meeting in another country, but I didn't mention it to the company at all. So I was working from Albania for the first month, and I had this super cool Airbnb. I remember I was so excited, but super nervous that they were going to find out. And I bought all my, I had thought it through a lot. I had a work setup that was completely portable. I'm using it right now, actually. I've got a portable second monitor, which is mounted on a tripod. it's a very, very portable setup. So I moved to Albania with this setup. It's the first time I've ever worked as a digital nomad, I guess. So I had this really, really cool Airbnb in the south of Albania, and it had this sea view. It was a penthouse apartment, and I paid about £450 for the month, I think. Maybe 500 actually. But it was a 2-bed apartment with a balcony and this amazing view. The only thing that wasn't fantastic was the Wi-Fi. But anyway, I was working from there a lot. I was working from the dining room table in this apartment, which was a very spacious apartment. But I remember the back pain I had from this chair working in this apartment. But it was worth it because the climate was insane. Actually, it wasn't all positives from that month. I remember being quite lonely at times, but I did eventually meet people in Saranda, which is the name of the town. And I did eventually meet people, and most of them were other digital nomads. So we had some common ground, and it was a really cool experience. And I stayed there for a month, and my company the company I was working for had no idea. They never once realized basically, and I wasn't doing like a great job of hiding my location either. There's definitely more I could have done. My work laptop was very locked down, so I couldn't just install like a VPN or something. So it was a lot of the connections I was doing were unprotected. So they could have probably just checked from logs. More on that later. So yeah, I did a month in Albania. It was super cool. It was actually my second time in Albania. I'd previously done a holiday there for like a week, somewhere I wanted to go back to. And then the second month, I went to Bulgaria. I was in Sofia, which is the capital, and I stayed for the first ever time in a co-living. A co-living, for those of you who don't know, it's like a hostel. It's like a hotel, but it's got office space and a shared kitchen. And for me, this is something that's really cool. It's a really cool concept because the majority of people who live there are working. Actually, nearly all. There was a few students who were there who were studying at like Sofia University, but the majority were entrepreneurs, business owners. And I got really inspired in this place. I met some other developers as well who were working like contractor jobs, or they were working in like crypto. And I was extremely inspired in this place. I think I don't think I've ever been more motivated in my life than when I was living in that place for that month. And I worked loads, and I built my personal portfolio. To be honest, I did take advantage of being in Sofia, but not as much as I could have done. I was trying to live on a budget, and I definitely did live on a budget. I'm not saying I didn't enjoy myself, but I worked a lot, and it had this amazing co-working space on the top floor with a view of like the city skyline. It was really beautiful, and I got a pretty good deal on it. I think I paid around £700 to £800 for that. It was like a hotel room, but the room was huge. It was absolutely massive. And the facilities were great. Weekly cleaning, gym on site. It had everything. I was so unbelievably productive in this place, and I made some great friends. And hopefully a few of them will come on this podcast in time. I've got big plans to bring some people from that place on this podcast because they inspired me a lot. So yeah, I stayed for a month in Bulgaria, and the company still didn't know. And then I went back to England for Christmas in December. This is December 2023. Great, working as normal. But actually, I had the next trip planned already because I wanted to keep traveling and working. Now, I didn't know at that point that the next trip I was planning is the trip that I would still be on now 6 months later. So what happened? This is a bit of a mess. So I went to Barcelona, and what had basically happened was over December, some like IT policy had changed in the company I was working for. So I flew out to Barcelona on New Year's Eve, and I partied New Year's Eve in Barcelona without alcohol, by the way. I was completely sober at that time. Ever since my trip in 2022 up until January this year, I was completely sober, not drinking at all, and doing quite a lot of traveling as well, and just enjoying it, but sober, and that was incredible. Something I'd like to do again in time, but I think I found an okay balance at the moment. So yeah, so I went to Barcelona, and about a week in, my IP got pulled by the company, and they asked me, "Are you working from abroad?" I said yes. I wasn't going to lie. It was obvious. I'd actually been managed to get a VPN onto my work laptop, and they still managed to get me. They thought I'd been working from Sweden as well, because somewhere along the way my IP bounced to another country. Not sure how that happened, but yeah, there was kind of like some radio silence after this point. They told me that it wasn't allowed, but they needed to spend some time to work out what action to take. My manager was very chill about it, completely surprised, but I basically was pushing for an ultimatum from them because I wanted to know what the situation was. So they told me eventually, they told me eventually after about three weeks after finding out, 3 or 4 weeks, they said, you need to come back to England by March the 1st. And so at this point, I'd spent a month in Barcelona, and then I moved to a co-living in a place in northern Spain called Santiago de Compostela. And okay, it was like a week after arriving in Santiago that they told me this information. And I immediately had to make this choice. I was like, okay, so I've got rent booked past the point that they want me to come home, but I don't want to come home. It was basically where I was at. I was like, I've got unfinished business here. I want to go travel. And also bear in mind, where I've been in Bulgaria, I've been surrounded by like entrepreneurs. I just arrived in Santiago, I was surrounded by some entrepreneurs again. Again, brilliant people. Cannot recommend co-living enough. If you get the opportunity to go and live in one of these places, I recommend it wholeheartedly. And I was very inspired and seeing that it was viable to start your own business. So I remember being extremely stressed at this time, actually, thinking maybe I should just come home, play it safe. But I'm guessing some of you can work out from the fact that I'm not in England right now what option I might have taken. So I remember specifically spending a complete Saturday afternoon sat meditating on this idea, and I did a lot of journaling, and I thought, what am I going to do? And I made the decision that I was going to start my own business, which I'd already kind of started putting into motion because it was an idea that I wanted to work on. So I said to myself, I'm going to go to Colombia, and I'm going to go and work on it full time. Now, I was going to go to Medellin. That was my favorite place that I stayed in Colombia in my backpacking trip a few years ago. And I ended up staying in Medellin for nearly 3 months. It's only recently I've moved to Bogota, just because I wanted to change, actually. But I stayed three months in Medellin, which is an incredible city and a great place for like networking. There's a lot of like business related stuff going down there. A lot of nomads live there. It's a great climate. The Spanish they speak there is super cool. The accent is incredible. And I was like, I'm just going to send it, and I'm just going to go there. And I put in my notice at this company I was working for about 11 months after starting, which my manager was shocked about. Honestly, I left on good terms with them, and my only regret is that I don't know. I don't have a regret about it. I would have liked to stay longer, I guess, because I really liked the team. I was enjoying the product, but I felt this need for growth outside of that company, and I decided to just follow the dream. I decided to just go for it, and so I moved to Medellin. Ended up sending my laptop back to the UK from Spain. It was all very crazy. So in Santiago, I began working a lot harder on the business, making a lot of marketing content, and I was working through my notice period at the company I was working for, which I'm not going to name, by the way. I think that's just kind of unprofessional. If you guys dig enough, you can probably find it. So I was just like working very hard, weekends, evenings until late, creating marketing content, doing out cold outreach, research on how to grow like a small software company, how to find clients, how to provide services, I picked a niche, which was ed tech, um, which is education technology. And I decided that that's where I was going to search for clients because I really enjoyed language learning. I always wanted to create like a language learning app. That's something that I've been working on recently, actually, is my idea for a language learning app, which has been really interesting. And I've actually had some correspondence with owners of language learning app companies, which has been crazy. And that was through like marketing content that mentioned certain products. So that was really cool. And I tried a number of strategies, and then I spent some time in Madrid working. My brother came to visit me, so I did take some downtime as well. And then I went to Colombia and arrived in Medellin in what was like a flat share, but it's like a flat share, basically like a co-living. It had office space, but it's through Airbnb, not through coliving.com, which is where I would usually go and find co-living accommodation. So I arrived in Medellin, and in Medellin is where the disasters begin. So, where do we begin? Let's start at the very first few days. So, Colombia is a country that in the major cities, card payments are quite widely accepted. But if you go to any like small shop or outside of any major cities, you need cash. Like it's got a lot better since I was last in Colombia. A lot more places take card now, but there's a lot of places that don't, and you basically need cash to survive. So picture me, just arrived back in Colombia, hot Medellin weather. It's like 30 degrees. And I go to the cash point and I put in my debit card that I've used for the last year traveling, put in my PIN number, and there's an error on the screen. I was like, okay, let me try another one. So I try a different cash point, error. This is my only debit card that I've got with me. And it turns out that the chip on it is not working at all. It's completely broken. I'm like, oh my God, I'm in Colombia without the ability to withdraw from cash points. That's not good. Like that, as a traveler, as a solo traveler who doesn't know anyone who can help you out, that is not a good position to be in. Okay, not being able to withdraw money, that's a bit of a disaster. And I was like, oh my God, kind of freaking out a little bit, but trying to stay calm, crisis management. I have my credit card with me, but if any of you know, when you withdraw from a cash point on a credit card, you end up paying a lot of money, right? You end up paying fees. I was like, okay, well, this time I'm going to do that just so I've got some money in my wallet. And I withdrew like a fair amount of cash. So just so that I had some pesos. And I paid the fee. I ate the fee, which was a lot. It was like 20% along with the cash point fee, which was bad in itself. So I was like, oh my God, how am I going to get around this? So since I arrived in Colombia, I've had to send myself money through Western Union. I don't know if any of you have ever used Western Union. It's far from an ideal situation. I don't know if any of you have used Western Union. It's far from an ideal service to be using regularly. And honestly, it does work well, and it costs about £4 per withdrawal. And it works well, but it's just a pain. And basically, it's just a pain. Like every time I need to get cash out, I have to go to a Western Union office with my passport, and I have to fiddle around in the app and basically send a bulk amount of money and then bring it back and store it in my, like a secure place in my apartment, basically. But the thing is, in Colombia, you don't really want to be walking around with a large amount of money. It is definitely a safety concern to be walking around with a large amount of money like that, especially when it's like a month's living costs, and I was sending money in bulk because I didn't want to keep going to the Western Union office. So this was a stress. This was definitely a stress and something that I could have really done without, I'm going to be honest, but it doesn't stop there. So I'm living in this place in an area of Medellin called Laureles, and things are going well. And on my first few days, I meet this guy who I'm not going to name out of, I don't think it's it would be a good idea to name name him actually. Anyway, so I arrive at this accommodation, and there's a few other people living there, and I meet this guy who's living in my accommodation. And I'm not going to go into the full story of this because I think I could definitely touch on it in another podcast episode. And it's quite complex, but this guy basically ended up assaulting me twice. It was a very crazy situation, one of the craziest things that's happened to me. And I've never seen someone get so mad so quickly. And yeah, it was not a good experience. And basically, I got punched in the head after trying to defend myself. And yeah, so this was not a good moment. I ended up leaving that accommodation, visiting a German friend who I met on my last trip, who happened to be in Colombia because he's got a girlfriend from Colombia. I spent some time in a different part of the city and basically checked into a hotel for a few nights while I worked things out, raised a case with Airbnb. And because I tried to defend myself, Airbnb suspended my account while they conducted an investigation. So I couldn't book into another long-term Airbnb rental and just move out and get on with like my business idea and just get on with the reason that I'd moved to Colombia. No, that wasn't an option because Airbnb suspended my account, and there's not really any good alternatives to Airbnb in Colombia for foreigners to rent accommodation long term, unless you go through like a Facebook group, which is kind of sketchy. So I ended up staying in a hotel that actually Airbnb did pay for that, and props to them for that. Actually, this happened just before my birthday, and one of the nights I stayed in a very, very fancy hotel in one of the nicest parts of Medellin, and that I woke up on my birthday actually in this hotel, and so that was kind of a cool perk, I guess. But eventually, the investigation finished. The place that I was staying, so the rental I was staying in Medellin, got terminated by Airbnb, and they provided me with like a half refund for that because I'd stayed there for some time. And I think they refunded the other guy as well, which is kind of crazy. He ended up going back to the US. I remember the Airbnb host saw that on the cameras. And so I went back into the accommodation basically, and I was living there. And then Airbnb just terminated the listing. So I was forced to move out. I was planning to move out anyway, but like at a later date. So at this point, a whole load of drama's gone down in Medellin, and I eventually moved to a different part of the city in a different flat share with a Colombian lady, and eventually another Colombian girl who was also working from the apartment. And from then on, like the accommodation situation in Medellin was fine. It was all good. So, and yeah, but there was more dramas, more dramas to come. So, as I mentioned previously, my only way to get cash out was to use Western Union. Now, I decided to try and wire transfer some money to Western Union. I'm not entirely sure even what that is, but on the app it was an option. So I used the wire transfer feature. Basically, like a month's living cost just went missing in a in a transfer, and yeah, that was not a great feeling. I saw the money come out of my account and an error in the Western Union app. I was like, oh my God, I've lost a load of money, like a month's living costs. This was a bad moment. I immediately called up my UK bank, and they asked me like what was going on. I said, listen, I'm living in Colombia, and is there any way you can reverse this transaction? My mistake was to say that I was living in Colombia, because what happened next was I received a secure message in my banking app saying that my UK bank is shutting down my bank account because I don't live in the UK. So I get in touch with them again. I'm like, oh no, I'm like temporarily living here, and I'll be home soon. And they go, oh okay. But that was pretty anxiety inducing. I can't lie. They were threatening to shut down my business account and my personal account, which was crazy. I couldn't really see why, because I know plenty of nomads who've never had this problem, but I think I it was my own fault for mentioning on the phone that like I was living in Colombia. What I should have said was I'm visiting Colombia. That would have been better phrasing. But they took it on themselves to try and shut down my accounts, I should say. So yeah, that was another not great moment. And at this point, I'm thinking, oh my god, why am I doing this? A lot's going wrong. And meanwhile, like I'm trying to just find customers. I'm just trying to find clients. I'm just like trying to start my business. And up until this point, I was not having a lot of success. I'd had some client meetings, I'd had a lot of no shows, and I'd done quite a lot of networking, but there wasn't any money coming in. You know what I mean? And this is not a good feeling when you've quit your job. So there's no money coming in, and all of these disasters are happening. And I'm like, oh God, like, this is not good. This is not good at all. And just after all, like, so on to the next disaster, I guess, which it was nearly a disaster. So after the first Western Union transaction had failed, I tried to send it again using Western Union, but using the like regular Google Pay method that I've been using before, which was a bit more expensive, but who cares as long as it actually turns up. So I send a Western Union payment with the name Angus Gorkroger. Now, I have two middle names and I never use them. This is relevant for later. So I go along to the Western Union office and I present my passport to the guy and the number for the transaction. And he looks at my passport and he says, "Where are the middle names on this transaction?" This guy's refusing to give me the money that I've sent to myself because I didn't include my two middle names on the transaction. Two middle names that I literally never use, but they're on my passport. Now, the reason for this is actually because in Colombia, these names are very important. Everyone has like four names, so you have to put all of your names on the transaction. Otherwise, yeah, it's it could appear that like you're the wrong person, basically. So yeah, this was not ideal. He was refusing to give me the money, but eventually he did give me the money, and everything was good. So he eventually gave me the money, and I went back to my apartment, and things were looking okay. Things were looking better, but I started getting migraines basically due to the stress of starting a business and all of these disasters that were going on. So actually, kind of out of nowhere, in the next few days, I managed to land my first client for my business. And this was super cool, a super great feeling. And I'm still working with this client at this point, which is really cool. Yeah, it was a good start. And then I landed my second client about a week afterwards. There was a lot of drama that went down with that client. Actually, it was far from perfect, but yeah, it was part of the experience. It was money in the bank as opposed to not money in the bank. And you know, I was doing work, and I felt like this was all worth it for something. And yeah, my business made money. It was, you know, it's making money. It's going in the right direction. But I continue getting like migraines, feeling very stressed about the whole situation. And I decided to start looking for jobs again in the UK, like remote working jobs. So I changed my status on LinkedIn to open for work. And yeah, so about 3 weeks after doing that, which was actually a very short amount of time, I landed a new job, which I'm going back to work. I'm going back to the UK to work that job, and they're waiting for me at the moment while I finish up with this client, because the contract date ends at the end of July, and then I'm going to be back in the UK and starting a brand new job. So this has been a real crazy experience up until now. It's a good story though, so I wanted to share it with all of you who are listening. This podcast needs to be somewhat personal, and you guys need to understand my situation and motivations for creating this. This is something that I'm working on with a lot of my free time at the moment. I do have work for my client, but it's not taking up a lot of my hours in a week. So for that reason, I'm creating a lot of podcast content and spending a lot of time editing video and just trying to enjoy the last like month of traveling before I head back, month and a half of traveling before I head back to the UK. But I've got time to work on projects, and this is my new project. That's why I invested in the mic. I'm really passionate about podcasts, forming connections with people, and I eventually want to start interviewing people. And I wanted this podcast to take that format as well. But I feel like to start with, it needs to have this format so I can practice like speaking to a camera because the only way you improve at creating content is by creating content. And this is a very new start for me. So I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you got to this point, please leave a like, please follow the podcast and leave a good rating. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found this story interesting. It's a bit of a background on me, something a bit different from the previous 2 episodes. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.